Hello, I'm Danny Duran, and this is the Infinite Jigsaw Podcast, a place for honest conversation, discovery, and with a genuine incentive to improve sense making. In this special episode, I'm very pleased to be joined by three quite wise men who, as chortling already, who as a trinity go to form a very popular faith and current affairs podcast. Yes, I'm joined by Reverends Jamie, Tom and Daniel from the Irreverend Podcast for a dual edition and a retrospective of the first year of the Irreverend. And also we'll be looking forward to a time of year that vicars have a special expertise in, that being Christmas. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome and seasonal greetings to the podcast.
Seasonal Advent greetings to you.
Advent greetings. Yeah, it's not Christmas yet. Not Christmas yet.
I have to apologise for Tom's. He's wearing a Christmas crown.
It's not a Christmas crown. It's Christ the King, actually.
And a reindeer jumper. Is it Christ the King? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I thought I put on my jaunty Peaky Blinders cap. I might take it off, actually. Not wearing that the whole time. But Tom, you look brilliant.
I think I look resplendent. Actually, I have these spare because I did a Christmas, Christ the King sort of children's activity. We decorated them. It went down very well with like rhinestone stickers, which are really good, actually. Might use them in more of my things.
And this is the new vicarage we see.
The rectory, please, Daniel.
Rectory. There are these, the chairs behind you look...
They are, a source of great division between my wife and I, because she really dislikes them and I love them. They are my grandfather's chairs, and we had many a Christmas sat around them. And I remember they were also upholstered in what could charitably called vomit yellow for some reason. So she doesn't really like that, but they do match.
You want to reframe that as mustard yellow, I think, Tom.
Well, having had a baby, there are all sorts of yellows that it looks like, and we won't go into. I have far too much of that already. But they're sort of handmade, hardwood, sort of neo art, sort of deco, maybe a bit of arts and craftiness in there. And that they have a matching table which can seat 12. And the problem is our dining room cannot seat 12, so some of them have been relegated to my office. But they're, it's nice to have them.
It looks nice.
I was just thinking, if you were sat in one of those chairs, rather than what looks like a swirly chair.
It is a swirly chair.
It would just look a bit more to the part, really.
You look more regal, but then your reindeer Christmas jumper probably is offsetting it.
Jamie, it's
pull the whole thing down, as well as the carpet behind you, which looks a bit like Twister.
Yeah,
it looks a bit flower power, doesn't it?
It looks like a children's playmat from the 80s.
Although one of the designs there does look like the coronavirus. So.
It does, actually, doesn't it? Maybe it's a prophecy. It's I tread upon the coronavirus daily. It's simply there to cover up a patch in a carpet which I couldn't be bothered to replace. That needs to be covered.
Something like that. We should probably just Danny, thank you. We're very happy to be on and to be doing this dual episode with you. Just call us to order whenever you want us to.
He's probably thinking, what on earth?
Well, I don't know about whether orders is a thing we've ever really managed, is it? Sort of kind of cascading chaos of the spirit, I feel, is more of our thing.
Yeah.
I'm not so used to the banter on my podcast, but nevertheless, Christmas attire and soft furnishings aside, let's talk about the happenings in 2021, which is a year that has given us much to discuss. And in the Irreverend Pod, you've covered all the major talking points with lots of intelligence and balance, which is crucial in this profoundly kind of imbalanced era we find ourselves living through, and some might say also subjected to, I guess. And as the Infinite Jigsaw Podcast is all about sense making and how to try to upgrade your understanding of just what the dickens is going on in the world, I'd like to ask you some questions based on the topics you've discussed throughout the year and see how your sense making and your opinions have altered and updated. So why not start with one of the weirdest and also, I guess, most life-altering elements of the COVID era, and that is lockdowns. What have you made of the overall effect of lockdowns, and has your view shifted at all from the first lockdown, which was way back in March 2020?
I mean, I'm quite it's a sense of often a kind of sense of some of society beginning to catch up with where I was, and I don't say that in a sort of arrogant way, but there's an article in the Unheard actually about this the other day, just sort of this idea that actually we're beginning to see some of those harms that we warned about, I think, at the beginning, and some of that balance coming back into the debate, sort of spurred on really by the realization, without wanting to jump ahead too far, that we're not actually that far away from being there again. Here we are, 2 years down the line, and almost back to square one. So I think it's sad, really. In a sense, it'd been lovely if some of the things that we said hadn't come to be. But we are seeing serious problems with education and children's mental health. We're seeing serious issues with the sort of normal health of the nation. We're seeing serious issues with inflation. We were talking just before the podcast started about the price of food. And I think serious issues with a government, as Lord Sumption pointed out right at the beginning of this, that has taken upon itself powers that no other government has ever deemed appropriate, and is capable of using them without even recourse to Parliament, even 24 months later, claiming emergency and expedience as the necessities. So here we are. Are we in a liberal democracy anymore? I don't think we are, potentially.
And there's a question on that is, do people actually care? I suppose looking at history over thousands of years, what we've had in the last couple of centuries is novel, is experimental.
But even,
and I'm just wondering now if there's look, Jonathan Sumption, isn't it? It's Jonathan.
Yeah.
He made the claim, I noticed a couple of weeks ago online, that off the record, a member of the government had said, what we really need now is a Napoleonic style government.
That was Matt Hancock. Yeah.
Was it? Well, there you go. And why isn't that blazoned on the front of the newspapers?
Right, because no one understands what it. No one understands. People don't understand what it means anymore.
Does it mean we should invade Egypt?
It means, Jamie. It means a centralized form of government in which the government decrees what you can do, rather than as in common law, where freedom. Well, for our listeners, where freedom is assumed unless the government explicitly, in fact, actually not actually the government, as it happens, unless tradition explicitly in the common law says you shouldn't. Which is a tradition founded on the wisdom of generations, which is why it preserves liberty in a sense. Our sort of culture has decided that certain things shouldn't be done over the years, and that has become convention, and therefore we follow it, which seems to be a sensible way.
It's codified in law.
It is codified in law now, but it doesn't need to be actually. It's codified in the past is almost enough.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the basic principle is that everything is permitted unless it's explicitly what's the word? Forbidden. Sorry, I couldn't think of the right word. That shows my vocabulary operating at its peak. So I mean, I agree with that. I think that's a serious departure.
So for instance, an example, you could wear anything you like as long as you wear something.
Yes.
I think strictly speaking, as long as no one's offended by what you wore. So you can go around without wearing it. I'm not saying you should, because obviously we're in a post-fall world where this would be inappropriate. But as long as no one's actually offended by what you wear.
Well, I would say it would be like you can wear whatever you like, so long as there's some reason that you shouldn't wear something. Like
so on a beach where
Tom shouldn't dress like he shouldn't wear like a burqa because he's not like a Muslim woman, for example, because that would be like deeply offensive, presumably.
I think there's a bit of a stereotype there, Jamie. That shouldn't. I mean, Muslim. I was in Egypt 2 years ago when you're allowed to travel outside of this country. And I remember a taxi driver telling us about how that was the burqa and the really sort of serious. Do I mean the burqa? I think I'm talking about the hijab. Hijab is a Bedouin thing, not a Muslim thing, and the burqa is a way of he said a way of giving honor to the Virgin Mary, but it's not mandated. But in any case, he actually said that it's a way of giving honor to the Virgin Mary is what he claimed. This is just a taxi driver in Cairo. I don't know whether it was true.
He may have been a source of authority. He may have been an Islamic scholar who was a taxi driver in his part-time role. Can I offer a general thought about this? So I think one of my concerns at the beginning was that I'm an instinctive conservative. So the idea in the sort of Burkean tradition, so to do with Edmund Burke, is that society grows up organically through convention. So through things that we've done together, which we've deemed to have, broadly speaking, worked, and then passed on from one generation to another. And as society or civilization develops, it gets gradually more and more complex, right? So it's like an ecosystem. It's like the ecosystem in nature. All the parts are reliant on each other. So when you make changes to something which has worked, you need to think about whether or not that's going to be good. And there's a good reason for hesitating and being cautious about those kind of things. I remember Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, talking about the way that's hard for conservatives to protest because you don't, when you go to a protest, you want to call for change and action and things like that. Whereas the conservative would hold up a banner which says something like hesitate or think rationally or something like that. Think clearly.
What do we want? Classical buildings. When we want them when it's convenient.
Yeah, exactly.
We're rubbish at it, really.
What do we want? Well thought through and gradual change according to deep reflection upon the wisdom of tradition or something like that. But anyway, the point is like, if you think of society like an ecosystem and then you say, well, we're going to have a lockdown, then that really violates that kind of conservative principle in quite a significant way. Broadly speaking, in society, we're doing something that works, right? So if you stop basically all of it, then you're stopping all the stuff that works, and you can't see what the consequences will be. And it's likely that most of the consequences will be bad, if not terrible. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing, for example, just to take one of many examples, the breakdown of the NHS. Now, the NHS, as a system, it's not something that I think particularly works brilliantly anyway, but it was working to an extent. Now we've got, I don't know what the latest statistics are, but I saw, for example, Macmillan Cancer Charity saying that there's been sort of 50,000 missed cancer diagnoses in the last 6 months or something like that. We've got these horrific waiting lists, tens of thousands of people on wait, or millions of people on waiting lists, probably. People can't see their GPs and so on. So this is just one of the consequences of shutting down this ecosystem. And in many ways, if they'd had actual conservative thinkers in government calling the shots, these concerns would have been taken seriously. But of course, whatever happened. They panicked. They shut it down.
I mean, the irony is that the first lockdown was purported to save the NHS, and by reducing the not by stopping COVID, it must be said, but by reducing the peak and spreading it out over a longer period, which was actually had a modicum of sort of sense behind it. It's not a completely senseless idea. The problem is, of course, what this is when it sort of extended out, when it happened the second time and a third time, the cumulative damage from all of those things really has led us to a place where not only have we suffered what they feared, which was a breakdown of the NHS, because that's what we're in. Let's make no mistake about it. We're in that, and it's not COVID related. We were seeing a breakdown caused by the measures attempting to prevent a breakdown. Yeah. So, but not only that, but we've inflicted enormous damage on society in order to stop something which they couldn't stop, and has caused their own problems. And so, the side effects are worse than, which is again, it's the sort of things we were saying. I believe Trump said it, didn't he?
Cure is worse than the disease.
Is the cure worse than the disease? And it's a good question to ask. I've been meditating upon just war theory a bit, and the Catholic, and I'm not going to be mean about them for once. So, the Catholic doctrine in the Catechism says that you need to, in order for a war to be legitimate, it needs to be, amongst other things, all other means need to have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success, and the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And I think lockdown fails on all of those three things. If it was a war, which politicians are keen to use that sort of language, then it is not a just war, and it shouldn't be supported.
How it got to this place fascinated me within the first few weeks of the prime ministerial announcement, because a month or so before that, I'd done the last rites of a parishioner who was the last remaining survivor of the Jersey Nazi occupation. In fact, he was a vicar's son, and he's written a book about it. We ended up doing his funeral outside on the road when the lockdowns were in. But one of the comments that haunted me is he said he was surprised as a child when the invasion happened, how compliant the Brits were. And there was a resistance, but it wasn't actually as big as you thought. You know, if you think of the kind of national narrative, the way we understand ourselves, you'd have thought that there would have been a bloodbath down almost to the last man. You know, what's the line from Shakespeare, from Henry V? You know, cry freedom and let forth the dogs of war. Yeah. But instead, it within hours, everyone was, oh, you know, this is the new authority. We've just got to get on with it. Oh yeah, the Jews. Well, you know, we'll just have to, you know, we have to play it safe. And he was troubled by this, and it was something that remained with him for the rest of his life. And so I found it paradoxical that there, a few weeks later, I felt like I was seeing the same thing. And we know, don't we, from very sort of open, documented interviews and things, people like Neil Ferguson and the Prime Minister were actually surprised that the British didn't kick up a fuss, you know, and that, in fact, I think Ferguson's famous piece, isn't it, is about China. What China did, we never thought we could pull off. Then we saw Italy do it, and the rest cascaded, and thought, well, here we go. And it struck me at the time, what is it that's happened to us? Maybe, you know.
But it's always been the case. I mean,
that place.
The Patains have always been far more common than the Schindlers, so to speak. You know, people are much more prepared to just say, you know, it's not all that bad, really. It'll be over, than they are to actually put themselves into serious risk in order to prevent tyranny. It's a fact of the sort of there's a sort of at the core of humanity is a serious lack of courage. I think
there's a plausibility structure in this situation. So in Germany, there was a plausibility structure in place, wasn't it, which was to do with like the breakdown of the economy, the Treaty of Versailles, and all that kind of stuff. And so Hitler comes along and he says, you know, I'm going to rebuild the economy. We're being stamped on by the Allied powers, etc. You know, what we need to do is X, Y, and Z. And then people said, okay, great, yeah, that sounds really plausible. And perhaps, you know, I don't know how much, I mean, honestly, my World War II history isn't amazing, but I don't know, like perhaps they didn't know about everything that was going on, at least not at first. And so to them, it was like, it was a kind of step-by-step process where they were as a population taken from point A to point B to point C. And I think it's a similar thing here, isn't it? There's a plausibility structure that people buy into, which is to do with it's to do with science as an authority. It's to do with fear, you know. So people are afraid, and when people are afraid, they will do extreme things. So you're going to die unless you do X, Y, and Z. For many people, the X, Y, and Z there is quite extensive. There's a lot that they'll do, and because it's coming from this authority, the scientific authority, it's plausible. So I think it's something like that, isn't it? There's a plausibility structure which the government and other governments have tapped into, and they've done that really well.
Well, I think Paul Kingsnorth, the philosopher, he's got a recent essay out on Unheard, which I sort of mentioned already. It's called "How Fear Fuels the Vaccine Wars," and actually, he started off in his thesis is there are two tribes. One tribe the sort of the government side, so to speak, says this: lockdowns are needed to contain the virus, masks work and need to be mandated, vaccines are safe, people should take the vaccine to protect themselves and others, vaccine passports will help open things up and encourage those who are hesitant to get vaccinated. So that's one side. And it says the other side is an alternative sort of story, which is crystallizing, which is lockdowns are not needed, masks do not work, the safety and efficiency of the vaccines are being oversold, vaccine passports will not only fail, but segregate society. And in other words, we're in a slippery slope that leads towards increasingly draconian biopolitical control measures, the grip of which is unlikely to release even once the pandemic is over. And, you know, I think we know where, and I think he sums up quite coherently there, the two polarizing sides. Now, he wants to see debate between them because he, as a sort of, as a starting point. And we sort of spoke a little bit about this with Laura Dodsworth as a sort of, we need to start cross-narrative discussions and try and dwell in each other's position. The problem is that the level of propaganda that's being pushed on the population, that has been pushed, is such that at the moment, at least, until the governments sort of step back from this and actually take away what Brendan O'Neill called the sword of Damocles hanging over our civil liberties, then we can't start that process of healing. Yeah. Which is what actually has made this week so painful, because I felt a start of that process of healing as people came together and said, right, we're through this now. You know, we've done what we needed to do. We can now start thinking a bit more rationally about where we are and where we need to be. And suddenly we've been thrown back by our medical overlords into sort of chaos as people once again divided.
Yeah.
Well, if I can just interject there, and well, I think we're stepping forward into a lot of the points we're going to get to in typical Reverend style there. So if I could just sort of zero in, Daniel, you mentioned compliance and non-compliance. Jamie mentioned the lack of the inclusion of conservative thinking in governments, and Tom mentioned the man's name. So let's talk about Trump, and let's move on to an event that happened in early 2021 that not only captured the world's media, but had a profound ramification at the time, and certainly still does. So what are your thoughts on Donald Trump, on the US election, and also the presidency of one Joe Biden?
I think Bethel probably put it all in one word when we spoke to her a couple of weeks ago, didn't she? She simply said, "sigh," because and I think we've been quite balanced on this in a sense, because we spoke quite at length about how Trump was not the sort of neither the Antichrist nor the Christ figure that some people made him out to be. And he manifestly failed to do what he tried to do, which is to clean out the swamp, so to speak. And he did that because of his own, I think, deep personality flaws and inability to form a sort of coherent, philosophical kind of thing that you could buy into and have a government buy into. And he ended up with an incoherent government that I think in the end, despite the fact that I believe he got the most votes that a Republican president has ever got, failing to get the either the popular vote or the electoral college votes.
That's if you assume that the election was not rigged.
Well, Jamie, I'm not prepared to go down that really. I'm not convinced that wide scale fraud is necessary to explain what happened.
Well, no, it might not be necessary, but it might be nevertheless what happened. I mean, I do think look, to be honest with you, I'm not the most knowledgeable about this, but it does seem to me like the election practices or voting practices in the US in general are pretty dodgy. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if there was some skullduggery involved. These Dominion machines, they are connected to the internet, for example. This is not great. There's this thing with the mail-in ballots and so on and so forth. I just don't think it's something should be dismissed as an option. I mean, you look at Biden and you think, how is this man the US president? I mean, he's with all due compassion, he is barely sentient. So
I mean, that's very harsh.
No, it's Tom. It's not Tom. It's not very harsh. I was watching videos of him in the run up to the election where he would be in the middle of, these were videos which were shot on people's phones, where he'd be in the middle of saying things and he'd literally forget what he was saying.
Jamie, I mean,
he'd have to be taken off by his handlers.
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I think accusing people manifestly suffering from dementia of some sort or forgetfulness or whatever of being unsentient is cruel, because I don't think it's true. I think they should be valued as people, but I know you do value them. I'm
not saying I don't value him as a person.
I just think you need to be a slight corrective there, because I do agree with you. I think it was a slightly odd choice for someone who, there was that weird interview, wasn't there, about children and his hairy legs in a pool, wasn't there? I mean, literally an interview about his hairy legs being stroked by children. It's a famous one, but he's obviously a disaster in position, isn't he? I mean, he's not really controlling events. He
did put himself forward for leadership, and
he did. Yeah.
If one's going to put themselves forward in leadership, then they're never going to be exempt from criticism.
I'm not saying exempted from criticism. I'm just saying don't be harsh. If it's a medical issue, then I think it's important to understand that the language needs to be moderated. I don't know.
But though I suppose what is shocking is that Joe Biden has the access to enormous power, including whatever it is, 30,000 nuclear weapons. It makes me wonder what is happening then in the sort of progressive American politics. That was the best that they could come up with. Was he, in a sense, the ideal sort of Mancunian candidate? Because in a sense, you can make Joe Biden into whatever you want.
Well, I mean, they made him into not Trump, didn't they? That's
page really for.
They simply made him into not Trump. And unfortunately, that also means not anything really. I mean, his withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster, and it becomes apparent that it was warned that it was going to be a disaster. He's got this, for someone who purports to be a Catholic, believing Catholic, he's got a very odd way of showing that in the legislation that he supports. And he's undone quite a lot of the things that we, I think, were to be celebrated about Trump's presidency in terms of removing abortion as a part of reproductive rights in their aid packages to the third world. So America are once again pushing for abortion as a way of controlling population, which is obviously not something that you'd expect a Christian leader to be doing. Yes, I agree, Daniel. I mean, the only thing is, I suspect he'd forget the code halfway through punching it in if he did ever want to load and launch them. So we're probably all right. But
well, unless they're fired to save Britain.
Wow, yeah. We've got our own. I mean,
yes, it's a bit rusty, but just needs a little bit of polish and vim. I was trying to sort of just what I was saying badly a few seconds ago was, I'm curious to why on the progressive side of politics, many of the politicians are bland, uncharismatic, technocratic, more bureaucratic, more sort of management styled, in their personalities.
It's interesting. There aren't any Tony Benns left, are there? That sort of that fiery left wing, quite outrageous figure. Even his children are sort of pale imitations of himself. I believe one of them is in politics still, aren't they?
I mean, for all his faults, Jeremy Corbyn was interesting, and like Bernie Sanders, there was a sense that you knew what the guy was thinking on the whole. Whereas it strikes me that as we've had all these lockdowns now being managed by politicians who seem a bit under impressive, really.
Character, it seems, doesn't get you anywhere in the upper echelons of politics.
Well, it's dangerous, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit like in the upper echelons of the church. You know, actually having people who might, you know, offend people, or I mean, we shouldn't be offending people, but you can't always avoid it, because the message of the cross is offensive to those who don't understand it. But you know, people who might actually speak truth, who might actually, you know, not pass everything past a media advisor, who might engage directly with people, sometimes forthrightly. These people are not finding their way into the upper echelons of the church because it's terrifying. It terrifies the bureaucratic structure to think what might actually happen.
Would you say that's a culture of safetyism then that's become endemic?
Yeah. Has the framework in the church that prohibits them from doing that arisen in the last couple of decades, 3 or 4 decades, as it has in the political system?
Well, I don't think you'd get a Pete Broadbent again as a vicar, as a bishop, you know. And I mean, we might agree or disagree with him in many ways, but Pete Broadbent is the just retired vicar, bishop of where is it? Williston, is it? I can't remember. Williston, yeah. And they replaced him with a racial advisor from Leicester diocese. But anyway, he was outspoken and he upset people, and he was grumpy and charismatic, and I just don't think you'd get him again, you know.
There was that famous moment, do you remember back in 2016 when in his inaugural speech, something at the end of it, Trump took out his phone and said, "Do you want me to carry on doing the Twitter thing?" And they all went, "Yeah!" You know? I thought at the time how interesting that was. Could you imagine equivalence in the church where
we say a curate, you know,
charismatic
whipped out his phone,
you know, who connected very directly with people.
Go on, Jamie.
I was just going to say, I think that the issue in the church is because, well, I don't know, but I think it's because we have all these different traditions in the church, which manifestly contradict each other, and you know, probably are expressions of more than one religion, if we're honest with ourselves. And so the situation is that we feel, for whatever reason, that we need leaders who represent those different traditions, you know, which is impossible because you can't represent things which contradict each other, right? So you can't really represent liberals and conservatives in the episcopate because those two viewpoints contradict each other.
One person, no.
Well, I would say as an organization you can't, right? Because it's like having a company which has two ideologically opposed focuses. So, but I was going to say, I mean, if that is the reason in the church, I wonder why it's sort of manifesting itself in politics. Why is Keir Starmer the leader of the Labour Party? We're told that it's because he's got a forensic mind. It's kind of unconvincing. So, what is it? Why is this sort of bland, completely uncharismatic man? Is it because Labour is a similar thing? Like it's a divide. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, I mean, ideologically divided.
I see again. The only problem is I'd offer as a counter example is Boris Johnson, who at least until he was reprogrammed at some point a year and a half ago, he was charismatic and interesting. He was capable of causing offence. He was outspoken. He was. You know, he was not, you know, and I think I was taken into an extent by that, because here was a politician who, after Theresa May, seemed to have personality, seemed to have the cajones to say what he writes, and you know, having followed him as a journalist and having felt at least at times a sort of a kinship with some of the thinking that he displayed then, you know. But then here we are, you know, being in top office has destroyed almost all of that.
Well, is that the reason, Tom? Was he allowed to get to that point because, you know, whoever it was in the Conservative Party or who who has influence over the nominations for the leadership, made sure that that was going to happen with Johnson, that he'd be neutered and that he'd have to toe the line.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's quite hard to prove that sort of thing, isn't it? But yeah.
Well, something's happened, hasn't it?
I was thinking that, because Danny's asking us to do sense making.
Oh yeah. Sorry, Danny.
Could it be that what we have, particularly in progressive politics, is a view of the world which is very managerial. In the end, the revolution comes down to paperwork. And if you take that view, then you're going to have to lean on all sorts of other authorities, like the science and so on. And it's going to be more attractive to a bureaucratic type of personality.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's why, ironically, we've now got this situation where the opposition in this country sounds more, it sounds more like we've got a parliament filled of bank managers and accountants, with the greatest respect to those sort of figures, or middle managers, the sort of Douglas Adams B-arc types, who will tend to lean on corporatist ideas of authority, whereas I think those on the more populist right will cut through quicker and more sharply. But and that was the Boris before March 22nd, 2020, to some extent, and then after that we seem to have got.
Yeah. Well, as we're on Boris, let's hover over Boris for a while and talk. Not a nice prospect, but
yeah, kind of. I'm just thinking of mounds of slightly sweaty flesh. Anyway, mop of hair at the top. Anyway, okay.
Well, let's go on to a subject that seems to be kind of inescapably confounding to the era of COVID, and that is, government overreach and specifically the face mask mandates. What do you make of the restriction and enforcement powers that the government has deigned to give themselves, and are face masks really necessary for public safety?
I think it's interesting how organizations adapt to things that really interest them when particularly there's the prize of power. Before, if you Googled all the stuff about, say, the police in the year before, it would be how they were overstretched, they were lacking manpower, and that crimes were going unreported, and so on and so on and so on. That this was an organization at its breaking point, and then suddenly, given the opportunity to change their role and police everybody, break into Granny's secret birthday party that she couldn't help but have with her neighbour, with half a dozen policemen, or go around on horseback looking at beaches to see who's there and who shouldn't be there, rather than chasing criminals. And because we're apparently a country that's got a real drug problem. I found that interesting. That there's a sense in which, given the opportunity, systems will go to the things that give those sort of those little prizes, and this was something that was very very achievable for the police and all sorts of other authorities like that. Why chase criminals when you can chase people with drones on moors going out for a walk?
And apparently now the Metropolitan Police, having not really got enough to do, are policing the new face mask mandate enthusiastically on the tube and on public transport, which no surprise really. I mean, there's they're just as corrupt as everything else. They're thoroughly they're unable to get out of that mindset. And all I can say to our listeners is, I am exempt are the magic words. I am exempt.
On face masks, I was listening to Jonathan Pajot talking about the symbolism of face masks. It's an episode that he did when these things started first coming out, during the COVID crisis. And to be honest, I only actually listened to half the episode, so I don't know how it concludes. But he was talking about the way that there's a kind of straightforward scientific rationale which is given for them, that it stops the transmission of the virus and so on. And then there's a symbolic aspect to it as well. So the symbolic aspect of it is that, or that I heard him say, and he might have said more than this, but it's that, basically you're sort of conveying to people, that I care about you, I don't want you to get the virus, and I want to keep you safe. So this is why I wear the mask. So I think that, he may go on to say something else, which I think about the symbolic aspect of the mask, which is I think that the mask is also something which conveys fear and is about conveying the seriousness of the pandemic. And we've spoken at length about Laura Dosworth in A State of Fear, who really illustrates that this was really the primary motivation, at least in the UK, of them being brought in whenever it was in June 2020, when the pandemic was at its, the ostensible pandemic was at its lowest point. So they needed something to keep it going on a psychological level. So they introduced the masks, and we were told, the science on masks is, I remember hearing Johnson say the science on masks is developing or whatever, which is just, manifestly false, really. And that's the point that I think I'd come back to Pajot on, and I don't know where he lands on it. I imagine he's quite skeptical about it. But to me, it's like the symbolic thing is very dependent upon the scientific reality. So if the scientific reality is that there is this really dangerous virus and you really can stop it by wearing a mask, then the symbolism is kind of is justified, I think, if that makes sense. So it would be a good thing to wear a mask because it would genuinely protect people. But if it doesn't protect people, and we're being asked to wear masks in order to signal our virtuous response to the situation, and to convey a sense of seriousness, to signal a sense of seriousness about the pandemic, which is really about the seeding and spreading of fear, then I think I object to it on that level. I think there's something manipulative and wrong about making people do that. And this is before we even talk about how some people find it very invasive and intrusive to be told by the government to conceal part of their face, and indeed to conceal their, to do the same thing to their children or whatever. So I think there's something deeply problematic about the whole thing.
And I think
it's also compliance in terms of, we take Pajot's thing on a macro level, that this is symbolic compliance, this is group tribal identity, that this is like wearing a political badge almost. You're making a statement, and that those who are pushing this know. I think that's what Laura's saying, isn't it? That those who are pushing this know that this is more than just protection, allegedly. That this is also a display of your compliance to the official narrative, and so to not do that, it is to make
you could be forgiven for assuming that this directive, this face mask mandate, came straight from the behavioural science unit, straight from the nudge unit.
Yeah, I think
I don't think any serious attempt has been made to justify cloth masks as anything other than a nudge, because it might be very different if they were saying, we need you to buy F95 masks, so we need you to wear them properly and have them fitted. We need to train you. This is absolutely, because that might do something. That might do something. They are medical grade masks, not the surgical mask. I'm talking the full face respirators type things, and they probably would have an effect. But that's not what the government is saying. That's not what they're saying. And of course, when they're used in the NHS, etc., they're replaced regularly. They are you only wear them for half an hour at a time, and you don't touch them. You're trained. The fact is, a cloth mask that you pull out of your pocket that's loose fitting, that's been washed a few times, or maybe not washed at all, if mine or anything like it. Not that I have any left. The idea is not to prevent a virus, because it's just absurd to think that might even be close to being able to do it. It's pointless, and it's even worse with those face shields that they seem to all count. The plastic ones, which I ended up wearing when I absolutely needed to wear a face covering. They're literally, it's you might as well have a rabbit's foot. There's no way they're doing anything at all.
I loathe seeing those in liturgies.
Rabbit's foots.
Rabbit's foot, yeah, rabbit's foot.
Are you in the right church? Anyway, no, go on.
The visors.
Yeah.
Liturgies, which just it's so anachronistic. Why anybody would wear that, or to wearing that and a mask?
Yeah. And it just illustrates the point that this isn't really about science or anything, is it?
No, it's behavioural.
It's a tokenism. It's a symbolic gesture, and I think everyone must know this on some level. Like those plastic viruses, they cannot do anything. I mean, they don't even cover like the bottom half of your face. So I mean, how can they?
There's one that you sometimes see in restaurants, which is just like comes out here and just there's a bit of plastic literally just over here, and you think,
I've seen that.
Have you not? I've seen it a couple of times. They're for waitresses, I think, and it's pointless.
Sorry, Daniel.
Just how do you that? All we've said is really nuanced. How on earth do you communicate any of that in 10 seconds when you have a parishioner who comes up to you and says, "Why aren't you wearing a mask?" Yeah. Or puts out on social media something about people who don't wear masks are,
Well, I mean, it comes. I mean,
well, perhaps the "I am exempt" line is the best line for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's the excuse, it's the legal excuse not to wear one, and secondly, because it also insinuates that if they ask the question, "Why are you exempt?" then they're delving into your private medical history or current medical status, which hopefully people have still got a semblance is wholly unacceptable in society.
But the problem is, and I kind of I'm a bit torn on this, because whilst I have a little exempt card which I use when I go to the shops, not so I don't upset people, especially sort of landing in a new parish. I have no intention of upsetting everyone sort of before I've even begun. I'll wait until at least a week after I've begun to do that. But the problem is that you're buying into this system. I remember going to the opticians in July, just after the face mask mandate had been stopped, and I went in there and I wasn't wearing a mask to pick up something. They said, "You're not wearing a mask. Will you wear a mask?" I said, "No, I don't wear masks." They said, "Are you exempt?" I said, "No, I don't wear masks." And they just sort of looked a bit flustered, and they said, "Oh, well, were you gelling your hands?" I said, "No, I've just done it." And she looked really flustered and sort of moved away from me. And I mean, I wish I had the courage to do that a bit often, but I think it does upset people. And it shouldn't, of course, because we know that hand washing isn't stopping the virus. That's been known since about April 2020, and yet it's still in everyone's psyche for some reason. But I wish more people would, because if everyone did that, then we'd be in a different situation.
Well, should we carry on with this theme of preventions and also kind of impositions, and just move on naturally to something that's wholly unnatural, and that's in the shape of vaccinations, vax passports, and the role of big pharma? Your thoughts, gents, on the morality of these things?
So, I mean, I can start off here. I mean, so I think one of the things that I find really surprising about this whole thing is the way that I mean, I do find this aspect of the narrative, the way that people have bought this and support it so strongly. I do find this surprising. I think particularly the view of big pharma as this kind of, people seem to have this idea that it's this sort of benevolent this benevolent sort of force, unambiguous force for good in the world. And I think that's funny, because that's never really been the impression that Big Pharma has given before. So I was listening, this was something I heard Jordan Peterson say, but apparently, I can't remember what it was, but like, you know, a certain amount of the biggest lawsuits in US history have been people suing Big Pharma. And I can't remember, it was the top 5 in US history or something like that, but it's something like that. So Big Pharma is you know, it's notorious.
Successful lawsuits as well is an important point.
Yeah, successful lawsuits. Yeah, so it's notoriously corrupt, money orientated, and you know, it's been sued countless times for bad practice, and so on and so forth. So we're in this kind of situation where Big Pharma has had this kind of makeover, and now the whole world is kind of reliant upon it. And it seems to me, I mean, this is just one of the aspects. I mean, there are many other important things to talk about, but really we're in this situation now. I mean, this is the whole thing. It's always been pointed towards the vaccine. I think it's been clear since the beginning, but we're in this situation now where really, I think what we're being told, and maybe you guys know better than me, but it seems to me now that what we're being told is that we're going to have, if we're complying with this system, which I'm not, I'm very open and happy to say, we're going to have 4 vaccines a year. So every is this right, or is it 3 vaccines a year? But I mean, 3 or 4 vaccines a year, what in perpetuity now. So I mean, you know, this is, you know, talk about a business plan. I mean, is nobody cynical about? I mean, there are some people who are cynical about it, obviously, but I mean, it just seems to me, I don't know what you chaps think, but I'm just so
with
surprised.
Indemnity to prosecution.
With indemnity, you know, complete indemnity, and so nothing can possibly happen to them, no matter who is injured or killed by the vaccines that they produce. So it's just, I mean, it's at the very least, I would think, even if people are kind of like wholly on board with what's going on, there must be at the very least some kind of question over accountability, right? Because at the moment, Big Pharma can basically do whatever it wants, and still, you know, this gravy train has started now, and it's hard to see where it's going to stop. So I don't know what you guys think, but that's my.
I was struck how recently it seems that people have returned in terms of dystopias, not so much to Huxley's Brave New World, though what we might be seeing has elements of that, or Orwell's 1984, but C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength,
yeah,
you know, is a working out of his great essay, The Abolition of Man, which itself, in many ways, is the sort of grandfather, really, of some of the great moral works like After Virtue by McIntyre, that he proposes, in a sense, a technocracy, an all-seeing technocracy, and you know, that comes out of his sense that the worst kind of tyrant is the one who genuinely thinks they're doing the best for us.
Yes, I'm constantly taken back to that quote. You know, you might actually be better off under a sort of the robber baron whose malice might at least be sated, who might go to sleep, you know, and at least whose power, whilst it could be really bad for you, is presumably going to be limited by his own sort of, but at some point he's going to be satiated, you know. Whereas to someone who thinks they're doing good for you will just, you know, that drive them on, that moral mission to interfere in every aspect of their life.
Their delusion knows no end.
Yeah.
But I mean, is it the case though that what we're living with is a kind of concealed robber baron anyway? I mean, is it that really it's important. I don't, how is anyone to tell this? But one of the drivers in this, I'm not saying it's the only driver, but one of the drivers is the pharmaceutical industry, and this is a massive driver. I mean, it has huge financial investment in the media, for example, and in political life. So I think we'd be naive to say that this isn't at the very least a massive driver in this. So I think we are there is on the face of it a benign technocracy, but nevertheless behind it there is still nevertheless the desire for profit and power. So there is a sense in which there is a kind of benign motivation, but there's also a malign motivation behind this as well.
I'm sort of slightly hesitant here because I'm not an anti-capitalist. I have no issue with the idea that the profit motive might align with efficiency and with doing good. I don't think there's necessarily a problem there. And I think if you push that too far, you end up in a sort of distrust of profit that sort of socialism or communism sort of requires. Not to say that I excuse big pharma, but I don't think it's necessarily the case that that just because they're driven by profit doesn't mean they're also wanting to do the good thing. But it's convenient. I talking of vaccines, I think it's because we've sort of had we have a number of different views on Irreverend, I think, about the vaccines, not about vaccine passports, which we're all against without any shadow of a doubt. But about vaccines, I mean, we all, I think, have some qualms in terms of the ethical issues of the use of aborted material in the vaccines, which drives my desire not to take up any of the currently licensed ones. There are in development ones that don't use the same technology, and which I would be happy to take. But for me, the key is in being informed and not coerced. I think every Christian and every person has the right to say, no, actually, I don't want to take this. And they have the right to all the information that they need to be able to say, is this the right choice for me? The idea that there's a sort of default, it should be taken, is not true of medicine, and it's certainly the government shouldn't be coercing people into it, which I feel, strongly that they are. So that's my main issue is my main thing is that people need to have the right to say no and not be thought of badly.
I think just going back to Jamie's point, which was, if I've got this right, was, is it benign, or is it more than benign? Are there malign forces behind?
Perhaps that's too strong a way of putting it, but hidden motivations, like on the face of it, philanthropy and so on, but actually, profit is really the driving force here, maybe.
I suppose I found myself generally more sympathetic to the cock-up theory, with the ingredients of groupthink and borrowing some of my previous career in IT, a sort of digital hive mind that can create these sort of environments. However, I think I've begun in the last few months to sort of find myself more moved towards the idea that there has been some planning in this. And I think I would be genuinely more red-pilled and further down the rabbit hole if central digital currencies were getting on the back on this very quickly, because that does require, it strikes me, some planning to put that into place.
Might you say that the extension of the credit of the limit that you can now tap on your card, the ever increasing extension, is a phased approach to that?
Exactly.
Again, it's nudge.
Yeah, and that the Chancellor of the Exchequer's announcement half a year ago that he was exploring something called Britcoin, where all your benefits could be paid from that, and taxation could be changed depending where you lived. So that we could encourage people to live in, let's say, cities rather than in the countryside or whatever, however that pans out. But that you have all sorts of powers that you could have with that, which include potentially the ability to lock down a whole nation at the switch of a button, because you can confine all purchases to Amazon. And just say, well, and
of course
you've done X,
you might have your junk food quota
allowance
met for the week. More
and the other thing, of course, it leads them to be able to do is to run negative interest rates, and you can't do anything about it. which is effectively another form of taxation, which they did flirt with actually about a year ago, as part of the sort of package, which obviously devalues devalues the savings of those who have been financially prudent in favour of those who are financially profligate.
But is that to cover lockdown costs? You're saying that they would.
Well, I mean, they could do it for whatever reason they like. If they feel the economy needs a sort of Keynesian boost, they could just whack a 1% interest rate onto a minus 1% interest rate effectively onto savings, and if you don't spend your money, then you lose it, and you lose it to the government.
Let's move on if we can, because time's rolling on and we must save ourselves for Christmas, as it were. So we've got some Christmas stuff to talk about, but before we do, let's move on and get your thoughts on climate change and wokery. And we're talking about agendas, which Big Pharma clearly has. Now, how much of both the agendas of climate change and the woke agenda do you think contain sound and honestly corroborated information, and how much of both are simply plays for political and economic power, aided as well by a complicit mainstream media, do you think?
I mean, I think there's a direct analogy between the climate change situation and the COVID situation, which is that there's an ostensible crisis which is being exaggerated in order to cause fear, in order to bring about political control. I think that's like the basic issue for me with climate change. Again, it's the institution of science is being invoked in this kind of godlike way, like the scientific consensus says this, therefore the inescapable conclusion is that the government must have these powers, and then they can bring about X, Y, and Z. And of course, my concern is that this is going to be now that the COVID thing has shifted the Overton window, so that people are familiar with the concept of lockdowns and things like that. Now the climate thing is going to be invoked in exactly the same way in order to bring about these patterns of conformity that politicians are looking for. And we've got no idea what those are going to be. But if they are things like, for example, taking away people's boilers and taking away people's cars and things like that, then that's going to impact poor people first. That's fact. That's fact. Old poor people will die, and poor people will be disadvantaged first. These millionaires and billionaires at Davos and at COP26 won't be affected at all. Sorry, Tom.
No, and I kind of experienced a bit. It's not just poor people and old people, but anyone who's not in the sort of safe urban multiple redundancy sort of position that our leaders are in. I had a power cut here yesterday, the first power cut I've had in years. I moved to a village and off the power went for 2 hours. Now, if that had taken a day to sort out, which it can do, this house would be incredibly cold because no one thought at some point to put in any heating that's independent of the power structure grid. I mean, I'm actually having some put in, I hope. But going across that, all these modern houses that don't have fireplaces, don't have chimneys, ground source heat pumps, and then the electricity goes. It's all very well if you're in London and you've got multiple redundancy across the whole board. If you're in a village, it doesn't work. And this is such a sort of metropolitan-centric kind of way of looking at life.
There was a bit of that in the first lockdown, wasn't there? That I probably did this myself. That we had exceptionally good weather in the first lockdown here, and everyone's saying, it's great. There's no cars on the road. It's quiet. You can have this sort of more family time.
The air's cleaner.
You can hear the birds and so on and so on. And you think, well, actually, those are actually bourgeois concerns. What if it was to the case of if it had been ramped up, well, the postman can't come to the door, and the shopkeeper can't serve you. We might sort of recoil at that. And it struck me that in the mainstream media, what we certainly got was a lot of journalists working from home who, clearly this was possible through the power of Zoom, which we're using today. And who wouldn't want this to go on in perpetuity? You know, if you get everything delivered and you've got a whole subclass of minions.
Yeah. But their bins still get collected.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think if that had stopped completely, you know, if this was like that COVID horror movie Songbird, we might be hearing a shriller voice. And I think there's elements of that within the climate discussion. I mean, I'm a bit ambiguous really as to whether we are or not in this, but I do recoil at the religiosity of it, and the idea. I think Paul Kingsnorth, again, the philosophical environmentalist, has come about this, that the idea that we can simply solve this purely on a technocratic basis, let's just throw some more technology at this, and that will put us in a right relationship with creation. I'm not convinced, because I think, you know, this goes right back. This is an existential problem that goes right back to the human heart and how we live in communion with each other. And you can't just throw more wind farms at a problem like that. You know, it requires us, I suppose, what we would say as more traditionally minded Christians, you know, it requires us to look within and question ourselves and put our own hand up. But, you know, within the sort of more metropolitan discussions, it's everyone else's fault. And I think that's what I really, I mean, around here where I live, there's a lot of the mind, body and spirit, new age types, you know, and you realize that actually that lifestyle, which where everyone tries to look like swampy, requires quite a good income.
Yeah.
It's a place of privilege this is being argued from, and
well, I mean, globally that's the case as well, isn't it? It's one of the great hypocrisies about climate change agenda is that you know, we're sitting there sneering at those countries that are reliant on fossil fuels when we reap the benefit of fossil fuel burning in order to get to a level of industrialization and technology which has allowed actually our energy usage to start to decrease because of efficiency. So like our bulbs now, our LED bulbs, which are we're not going to get in the third world, but will give you just as much light, if not more, for a fraction of the energy cost. But you know, it needs a certain amount. It's a bit like a catalyst in a chemical reaction where the initial energy required to break those initial bonds is once that's given, you need much less energy to continue the reaction. And a catalyst can help break those bonds. Technology can be that catalyst, but we can't sneer at them. We can't say. But also, I mean, I think one of the big issues with the climate change problem, and the biggest issue that I have with it, is the fact that it's much like COVID. It's not actually science; it's the science. We spoke about this a year ago. You know, how the science, with the sort of definite article, is monolithic and unchangeable. Whereas science is actually all about asking questions, and the questions are not able to be asked, anymore. And you can't get journals will not publish scientists who ask questions that are awkward to the agenda. If there is actually nothing to hide, then they should have no fear of that, because science will sort it out. You know. In the end,
there's an industry that's grown up now, isn't there? So they don't want to know the answer to the question. You know, does rising CO2 level, does that actually increase the temperature, or is there a more complicated or inverted causal relationship between those two things? They don't want to know the answer to that, because the answer to that has been decided, and now an industry has grown up around it, right? So it'd be very, very inconvenient to actually find out the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So, similarly, you can see that in our relationship with the third world, which is a very moral question, you know, in terms of we have a gated economy in the continent here in Europe, which really freezes out large parts of the developing world. If Africa had the freedom to buy and sell to us in the way that we have with ourselves, they could run us out of town in terms of as a product, but that's the last thing we want. So in the end, what we do is we put our we put our emotional sympathies in saying, oh well, we give them lots of charity, and we have lots of overseas aid projects there, when really what they want is say, for instance, nuclear technology. But who's going to Robert Mugabe the uranium,
Or indeed, well, he's gone now, isn't he? Or indeed, they just want to sell their grain to us at a competitive price. And whilst we're part of the EU, and as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware, continuing, we protect our farmers here against that prices through tariffs. So free trade is what we need, not fair trade, which is charity. Free trade drives economic sort of economies, so to speak, in the countries, whereas fair trade just pays for inefficiency.
Now, I think last year when we had the first lockdown, it was calculated by, well, actually just between first and second lockdown, that only kind of 47,000 people had died in Africa of COVID, which was. Yeah.
But millions are going to die of the effect of the lockdowns. Millions.
Exactly. That for every COVID death in the UK, how many multiples in terms of starvation?
Yeah, which is why
in Africa, and who gives a monkeys?
Well, of course, because Black lives, actually, the only Black lives that matter are Westernized Black lives. They don't give two hoots about. Black lives living in poverty in Nigeria because we've shut down the world, or Black lives who I went to Zambia years ago, but Zambia, a large chunk of their economy is tourism, and joyfully so, because it provides the money to preserve the special environments they have, and it gives a lot of employment to a lot of people there, and therefore brings everyone's standard of living up. Incalculable damage. They're probably back on the red list, aren't they, Zambia, because of Omicron. So I just I'm astounded that this was allowed to happen. Well, that was never really thought of. Oh, millions die in Africa. Oh well, at least our 80-year-olds are safe here. Even if lockdowns work,
Well, as we're talking about here the future, and that's the future of Africa, and you spoke before, Daniel, about where fault lies, and we've been pointing fingers throughout this podcast, throughout this chat, where fault lies, whether it be big pharma, whether it be governments and the characters within those governments, whether it be skullduggery in elections and things like that. But let's, lastly, before we go into Christmas, concentrate on a group where fault most certainly does not lie. And that is the children. So probably the most important and future defining facet of all this mess is the effect on children, and not the disease, because we know that largely they're not at risk, but they are at risk from restrictions and what you could term as the brazen theft of chunks of their childhood. And of course, the case for them having to undergo a medical procedure that they demonstrably do not require to protect them from COVID. So what are your thoughts on how children have not been protected throughout this mess?
I'm astonished and ashamed that our country has not put this to the forefront of its concerns, that the story has been manipulated and massaged so that as if children were collateral damage to this, because surely it is it's got to be the basis of a civilized country that our job is to protect our children, not for them to protect us. And I think I see it in my own children. I see it in schools work, just in conversation. You see it talking to student-aged people. They've taken an enormous hit, and at times, early on, you got the sort of Piers Morgan types. These lazy students who haven't been able to party, that sort of thing, or have graduations, blah blah blah. Those sort of pernicious comments, or
from people who you can be sure delighted in their graduation and in their parties, as I did, as I'm sure all of us here did. It was a very special day. Even now, Oxford, we're not filling the Sheldonian with graduates. They're only graduating in groups of 30. It was a very incredible day when I walked through those doors wearing my bachelor's gown, having shed my sub-fusk, and knowing that there was something that I'd achieved that was being recognised. I mean, and it's the same with Bristol, and when I graduated there, there's a sense in which we should celebrate learning, and that it should be a special day when people are sort of finally shown the doors of the university and sent out into real world, in my case, to rapidly return. And
I think what we're seeing is we have because society, our age profile makeup is top heavy, and it's largely populated now by boomers, who have their own particular concerns. I'm not trying to make a caricature here, but this is the generation of our parents who were at the height of all the 60s revolutions and stuff.
Are you not a boomer then, Daniel? I always thought you were a boomer. No,
it's too young. It's too young.
I'm a child of 1968. Don't dare put that.
No.
Yeah. I mean, Daniel, you are right though. I mean, I want to make two comments about this. I think the first thing is, in a sense, it is shocking the way that children have just been, manifestly sidelined, and I would say just straight up abused and traumatized through this situation. It is in a sense shocking, but we've also been a country which for decades now has been practicing the killing of children in the womb, and I think as such it constitutes a pattern of behavior whereby children are sidelined, are not protected, in order to promote the lifestyle that we live in this country and to enable our lifestyle to continue. So in a sense, I see a direct link between the practice of abortion and the way that children have been treated over the past couple of years. And then the second comment I'd like to make, I mean, there's obviously a huge amount of damage to kids schooling and just to missing out on life experiences, as we've been talking about. Unfortunately, my children are young enough not really to be affected by this, and we're not sending them to school anyway, so that doesn't affect us. We are homeschoolers. But the thing I really want to say, quite apart from all this stuff, is relates to this issue with the vaccine, which I didn't get a chance to say earlier. But the fact that we are now vaccinating children is absolutely insane. It's absolutely crazy, and it's immoral beyond belief. We know, apart from anything else, that children are not at serious risk from this virus. Now, who knows really what's driving this? But if any children suffer any kind of side effects or death from this virus, these are unnecessary. These do not need to happen. And the spurious justification that children transmitting this virus, even if it were true, which I'm not sure that it is, even if it were true, it would still be wrong to vaccinate children. I think you're putting children at risk for the benefit of older people. And this sorry, Tom, just let me finish this train of thought. The problem here is that when you start actually thinking rationally about this, then you'd have to apply this to older generations as well. So if you say, well, you shouldn't vaccinate a 12-year-old because a 12-year-old is not at risk of COVID, is probably more at risk from the vaccine, that then raises the question of, well, why should I not have it as a... Sorry, I just got a call. This keeps on happening when I've been doing this stuff. I'm just getting too popular. Sorry, I was mid-flow. That raises the question of why should I, as a 34-year-old, not have it, or why should a 50-year-old have it? Do you see the point I'm making? So this madness to drive everyone to get vaccinated, presumably on this kind of continual treadmill of like 4 vaccinations a year, it is inevitably going to apply to our children, and it's madness. It has to stop.
And of course, the sort of vaccination risks kind of get multiplied every time you have one, won't they? I mean, I think I sort of agree with everything that's been said, and it's what really irritates me and upsets me is that no one in schools seem to be reading any of the manifold papers now which have shown that schools are not driving infections. They tend to be reflective of community infections and not drivers of community infections, which is why SAGE got it so wrong when they predicted enormous wave when the schools reopened back in March. But even
there
now,
are some, Tom, just to say, there are some schools who are standing against it heroically, such as
I know.
Lady from Oxford, whose email we read out a while ago. I just think
absolutely
say that.
You're right, but the problem is that that's not the case generally, and certainly in the unions which have enjoyed this chance to virtue signal and for it's really to normal behavior. And I know that teachers I was speaking to saying that the children in the years they're teaching are well behind, they're unsocialized, they're not used to the discipline of school anymore. They are much harder to teach than previous years. And I'm not surprised because they've been abandoned again and again. And so why should they, it's quite obvious that our government, which, still tries to prosecute parents for taking them out for a week on holiday, but considers it quite all right to shut the schools down for 2 months. Doesn't value education, doesn't value children. So why should they care about being there? It's a reasonable assumption to make. It's logical. It's shouldn't be true, of course. School should be enjoyable.
It's to quote that great movie. What is the Matrix? The Matrix is control. Yeah. And that's the danger with all these narratives, is that they coalesce to become essentially control, because when people challenge the control, or when there's a multiplicity of scripts flying around, that those in power just cannot handle that.
Yeah, well, it's because if they were going to say, well, we don't mandate masks in schools, then people would say, well, why should I wear them in the shop then? It just keeps they have to go all in, and it ends up damaging everyone.
You have the craziness, don't you, of people. I mean, there was that famous White House press officer who put his mask on to walk to the podium, then took it off, and you get that sort of craziness where people begin to seem to act almost as if moving from one part of the room to the other makes all the difference, when clearly for a virus it doesn't. It doesn't at all.
Well, we had that stupidity. I don't know.
If you were to take it absolutely seriously about masks in restaurants,
complete madness in restaurants or
pubs. We should be sort of having them over our faces.
We should be using those Israeli eating masks that we discussed. That was a few weeks ago, didn't we, Jamie? Mm-hmm. That weird sort of pneumatically powered
automatic mask. Yeah, that opens as you raise your fork to it. I think the thing is if you say, well, we should make an exception for children, then it's kind of breaking the spell, isn't it? By saying that, by implying that this kind of all-powerful narrative can at points be relaxed or spoken against, and so children are, in a very real sense, being sacrificed to the narrative.
Yeah, they are. And let's try to give people a bit of a toolkit and a bit of sense making here. Can anybody think of arguments that a skeptical parent, or a parent that simply doesn't want to put their child through this medical procedure at this present moment, can offer to their partner, their own parents, you know, the in-laws, the school, the medical board, because the only one that I can think of, and it's landed with a couple of people, is that there's a medical decision here and there's a moral decision here. The medical decision is, are we getting our child vaccinated because it's going to keep them safe medically? So hopefully everybody knows now, statistically, children are not at risk from COVID. So you can almost tick that one off. If you get a nod from that one, that's good. So there's the moral question. Are we potentially doing them harm from getting the medical procedure? The answer to that potential is yes. So the argument is, if I'm wrong, and I'm putting this forward, if I'm wrong and the vaccinations are fine and the child goes through their life without any undue implications, then I'm just wrong. Silly old me. But if you're wrong, person that's getting your child vaccinated, you're very wrong. You're irreversibly wrong.
Yes.
So these are the sort of things that I think we've got to arm parents with, just to even stay off this irreversible procedure that they are countenancing having their child undergo. It's very important that they've got something to put forward to the powers.
Yeah, I agree, Dan. It needs to be a risk-benefit calculation for the individual involved, particularly, I would say, in everyone's case, but particularly in the case of children. I mean, apart from anything else, this argument, and we haven't even pointed this out yet, I mean, many people have said this, but this argument doesn't even make any sense, because if these vaccines work, then it shouldn't be relevant whether or not other people have been vaccinated, because you have the option to protect yourself with a vaccine that works, right? And if it doesn't work, then this is just a completely moot conversation. So to apply this mad logic to children is ridiculous. So it's got to be a cost benefit analysis for the children involved. Is this going to benefit your child? What are the risks associated with it? What are the benefits associated with it? The problem is that this whole narrative is suppressing the critical information that people need, which is about what these vaccines have been doing to people in terms of injuries and deaths. The fact is, we don't really know. There have been lots and lots of yellow card reports. I think it's like over 1,100,000, which is an enormous amount. But no one really knows how to interpret this data, because this doesn't fit the narrative. So, it's a mess, quite frankly.
That's going back to Brett Weinstein's piece, isn't it, about science being, an investigative craft. It's not about the science. It's about looking at that sort of data, and saying, "Oh, hang on a minute, what could be what could be the interpretations for that?" And there might be a whole load of interpretations that end up at war with each other, but one in the end at least will be given a chance to come through. Whereas what we have, in a sense, is control of the narrative.
Well, the key thing,
not science.
The key thing that Brett Weinstein said, I think, was about falsifiability, right? Is that science, in order for a proposition to be scientific, this is a theory of philosophy of science by Karl Popper, it has to be falsifiable, right? So you have to be able to show that it's wrong. And one of the things that Weinstein said was that science isn't about having a consensus or having experts telling you what's what. It's about having a faculty or a process to show when the experts are incorrect. So if you approach science in that way, and to be honest, I've heard people like Richard Dawkins. I've read stuff that Richard Dawkins has read when he talks in this way. Science isn't about confirming some kind of pre-established consensus. It's about showing where the consensus we currently have is wrong. That's what science is good at. It's about showing, it's about, we thought this, but we've actually discovered this. Now, the way that science is being employed in this political way means that they have to completely change the whole notion of what science is, such that it's now about defending this consensus, this kind of, it's like the city walls are up and it must be defended. But science is going to stand still if we operate in this way. And it's critical issue of something like vaccines, injuries, deaths, and so on. If we can't even have this conversation, then there is no reason to trust the establishments that are being put forward to us as trustworthy. And I think this is particularly pernicious in the case of children. It's just indefensible that we're approaching this. Anyone, even if you're absolutely pro the vaccine, should be open to a conversation about the evidence, the relevant evidence that we have in terms of what these vaccines might do to children and the benefit that it would, or not, that it would do them in terms of protecting them from the coronavirus. This has to be like the absolute center of any conversation about this. And I think it's, from my perspective, it's clear that this conversation is not being had publicly. I don't know what you guys think. It's my view on it. It's
being actively suppressed publicly.
Yeah.
Well, these are the facts of the matter. But if I can just, with all due respect, when I think of Jamie, we spoke on the podcast, Tom as well, Daniel, I hope to speak to you in the near future. And I think of vicars and reverends, of people that in their training are able to get to the heart of the matter. When someone, part of the congregation, comes to them with a problem, they don't have a ready answer so much as they've got a host of answers, and they're able to get to the heart of the matter. And in a few sentences, they're able to make that person understand a bit better their angst or their problem or their issue. And this is my challenge to you three. If a member of your congregation was going to come to you and say, listen, I've got this issue. I don't want my child to be vaccinated. My partner does. I'm coming under a lot of pressure. What do you say to them?
Daniel, you're the wise old owl here.
Oh gosh.
I think the problem is that that there's never a single easy answer. Yeah. Because you have to ask, well, what? For one thing, should I be interfering quite so directly in the life of a couple? All I could say is, if it happened to me, I guess, and the things I would say would probably be not far off what you said, actually, Danny, which is essentially asking who benefits. If that person who benefits is not the child, which in the case of these vaccines it is not, then should we really be giving it to them? Because medicine is about benefiting the person to whom it is applied.
That's a fundamental point. Yeah.
And hopefully that will land.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been the way that things have been done over the time. I mean, I used recently an analogy with somebody. Imagine if the government said that we must all take an antibiotic every day, all of us. We know from past practice that this would affect the viral ecology, to the point where these antibiotics would be useless within a very short space of time, because we would accelerate that process of antibiotics evolving. And I suppose if we're going to, if we're going to look at it on a societal level, if we're going to vaccinate children who don't need it, then surely we could be doing the equivalent. And I know that there have been scientific papers before the pandemic where there was this concern over vaccination, and that there was a parallel between antibiotics and vaccination, and that getting the balance wrong or going crazy, and giving medicine to everybody does have a wider application. That children could be looking to a future where antibiotics don't work, or where vaccines don't work, or where mutant variants come along that have vaccine escape properties.
And of course, this idea that the unvaccinated are causing vaccine escape properties to come is it doesn't make any sense by how selection works. Viruses don't just randomly generate anti-vaccine evading properties. They only would ever generate them in someone who is vaccinated in response to the antibodies that vaccinated person is producing. They don't just randomly, they don't have a plan. They infect as many people as they can. If they land in someone who's vaccinated, they will try and beat the vaccinated immune system by potentially, again, not with a plan, but just by generating copies of themselves, and maybe a copy comes out that can evade the immune system of this vaccinated person, and you get a vaccine evading variant. But that doesn't happen in the unvaccinated people. That process happens in the vaccinated people.
Here's a quote from The Spectator. I think it's The Spectator on Omicron. It's just a one-liner that was dropped in. There's also been speculation that Omicron is inherently less deadly to people with no pre-existing immunity. that's not possible, says the author. But everyone I spoke to said any definite conclusions are premature.
Well, I mean, there's been a number. I mean, Alpha variant, and I've heard it said about Omicron variant as well, have both potentially arisen first in patients who are being treated with antibody treatment. So that is where you take antibodies generated by one person and pump them into the blood of another person. And often this is done on immune suppressed people who can't produce their own antibodies. The problem is that their antibody protection is not adaptive like ours would be. So the battle is sort of, if you think of it as in terms of a battle between virus and immune system, the immune system cannot adapt if it is not the immune system that you are using to the virus. So you'd end up with a sort of in a battle plan that's completely inappropriate for the thing, and that's possibly been the case in both the Alpha variant and in the latest variant. So we have to be careful. It's not just simple that interventions are good.
I think that's one of the problems with technocracy, is that the world is looked at very digitally, ones and zeros, and that problems are seen to be mechanical, whereas a more analog, organic approach to things, ironically, and I think this also happens in solutions to climate change. Just stick a whole load of wind farms and solar panels. That these systems are highly complex and require that requires the ability to have these deep, nuanced discussions. I mean, I think what Jordan Peterson calls, high resolution thinking, where everything is thrown up in the air and open for discussion, as science and theology should be, but isn't when it's politicized. And that's where it's different. This is where it's different. I mean, this is going back to Danny's point, is how do you communicate that in a few words, in a sentence, when somebody's eyeballing you at the bus stop? How do you give that when clearly, as more conservative leaning people, we're just not good at that sort of stuff. We're not good at demos. We're not good at giving the.
I don't know, Daniel. Jamie and I were great at the demo in June. I thought it was a real.
The demonstrations have been going quite well, I thought.
Yeah, but,
I mean, just to return to Danny's thing, I think that obviously every situation is different, isn't it? But I think the issue's got to be what's best. What's best for your children, right? What's best for your child? I mean, surely that's going to be a central question in all of this.
Yeah.
And my limited experience of this kind of thing, I think people are more concerned. I mean, there's the altruistic argument, isn't it? But ultimately, I think people are concerned, particularly for their children, and those kind of arguments do still cut through the narrative, because if you're talking about injuring your own child, I think that does actually potentially injuring your own child. I think that does actually at least open a conversation that can't easily be dismissed, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've covered all these main talking points of the last year, and your first full year of the Irreverend Pod, and massive congratulations. I bet all three of you have hugely enjoyed what's happened to you, and the kind of whirlwind of support that you've had and listenership. Has it been brilliant?
Yeah,
it's been a surprise, Danny, because I'm not a big fan of any of this sort of thing. I couldn't
find you on Twitter, Tom. I found Jamie and Danny. I thought, well, I just had to write your name down like an Neanderthal.
I've not even got a Facebook page. So it's been quite extraordinary finding us leading a sort of. I'm not going to call it an online church, but I'm not quite sure what to call it because. But it's not sacramental. It would be lovely. It'd be lovely if we could all meet. I was trying to work out whether we could do an Irreverend tour and like book out pubs around the country and have services and actually form a church group. That'd be fantastic fun. But for me, it's been very strange, and I never thought it would take off. From Jamie and I, sort of mostly from a cathartic point of place, sort of finding some solace in talking about these things together. And then Daniel, the wise old owl of wisdom, but not a boomer.
Well, I think for many people that listen to you,
I'm much younger than Keanu and Brad.
Hello, boomers. I think for many people that have listened to you over the year, the feeling is you have literally put your heads above the parapet. You do belong to an institution, but institutional figures have not collectively, as far as I can see, put their heads above the parapet. There could be a podcast of 3 head teachers that do the same as yourselves, in an area of work where they could come under attack, as is yours. So all power to you, and thank you very much on behalf of everyone for the whole year. So it's a great job.
The institution hasn't just not put their heads above the parapet; they've actively built the parapet a few meters higher. I think it's fair to say.
Anglican efficiency. And I've got this from writings as well, from publishing stuff in journals and what have you. Has been the emails and letters, just the extraordinary stories. I think at the moment this week I've been getting one a day, quite profound stuff that people are sharing from a faith point of view. Usually, most of these emails, most of this correspondence has a conversion faith story in it, but that I find extraordinary in terms of I mean, I've written about this elsewhere, but in essentially, it would appear as if the hierarchy of the church is largely interested in chasing a very small number of guardianista, swampy social justice warriors who, if they had the opportunity to come to church, if they could be frog marched to church, persuaded to church, I don't know, given marijuana in church, whatever, they would still hate it and still think it was part of some sort of patriarchal conspiracy. And yet there are, I suspect, if the numbers that we're seeing who correspond with us, there's a huge constituency of people who, particularly in the last 20 months, have moved out of the shadows in terms of personal faith, but still feel homeless ecclesiastically. And they'll go to their parish church. The story we get, they go to the parish church on a Sunday morning and they don't get the welcome when they speak to the vicar. When they mention Irreverend, they're kicked out,
and that's why they perhaps feel that their church is yourselves and listening to your podcast. And Jamie and I think it was when we spoke about pride on the podcast, was very interested to talk about pride. I know it's something that you pay a lot of attention to, being prideful, and the pitfalls of being prideful. But if I may say so, you really should be proud, as well as you can muster it up, of what you've done over the last year. Now, I'm not sure, we have run over, and I'm not sure people have got meetings, etc. So I don't know if you wanted to do something on Christmas, or if you perhaps wanted to schedule and come together again for half an hour, 45 minutes.
I've been wearing my Christmas jumper and crown all this time.
So I thought that was your new clerical wear. I didn't realise you were doing it because it was Christmas.
Well, I was told it was a Christmas special, so I got my Christmas jumper. And then
Danny, I've got about 15 minutes before I need to go, so I can do 15 minutes. Is that enough for our Christmas?
Probably not. I mean, you don't want to gloss over Christmas, do you?
Okay, all right.
Well, I've got a very serious thing behind the crown, because it is about Christmas, because it makes me think when we're sort of wearing it. Obviously, crowns are usually found upon the heads of monarchs, and Queen Elizabeth sports one on state occasions and various things. But the kingship that Christ has through his incarnation, through his nativity, through his cross, his death and his resurrection and ascension, that kingship that he has gained is given to us in him and through him and by him. And it's far, far more glorious than the kingship and queenship that our monarchs share, because it's not an institution that fundamentally goes back to who can hit the hardest in the sort of 13th century, but it's an institution that goes back to the ultimate sacrifice of God for us. And so we sort of, Christmas is a funny time really, because it's a time of family, and that's right, and it's a time of jollity, and that's right, but it's also a time of enormous metaphysical disruption. The first Christmas, when God became human and the world changed forever, and so we can wear our crowns to eventually cast them down before his feet, even as we're lifted up into the royalty that he brings us. So Christmas is I just hope that everyone has a wonderful Christmas and remembers that it's all about God's sovereignty and not about whether Boris Johnson can take it away or give it to us or put restrictions in place. It's about God's sovereignty and God's saving power on this earth. That's why I wore this crown, Daniel.
Thank you. It's very well said.
I was struck by a few months ago being reminded of the words good news, which are often, I think, the potency are lost in translation, because we think of good news as happy, chirpy news, sort of something that is of maybe instant benefit to us, whereas the Greek, the euangelion, is a much more provocative word in the first century. It was this sort of royal news. It was the royal proclamation, so that when you were invaded, say Caesar comes in and takes over your land, the equivalent of a town crier would read the euangelion, which is essentially the terms and conditions of your invasion, and it would maybe begin by telling you how great Caesar was and is, the victories that he's had previously, where he comes from, his divinity, what he's going to do, and that essentially you have no way out of this. That this is it, that you can't sort of opt out of this. This is the new terrain. This is the new politics. And that struck me that, at Christmas we say the birth of Christ is good news, we see it in school nativities and what have you, a new kid born,
when you're allowed.
He's got a cardboard crown and the shepherds have got tea towel hats, and that's all lovely and cutesy. But actually what the Gospels are presenting is incredibly subversive. And the danger has been that we've presented a form of Christianity which only delivers sweeties spiritually, and presents the spiritual world as a kind of fairy tale Disneyland. Maybe that's because of the pressure, it's back to the baby boomers and the pressures of, wanting to present a kind of age of Aquarius where everyone gets something and God is a kind of cross between a therapist and Santa. And I suppose my question really is, I'd put this out to everyone and put it out. If I could eyeball the Archbishop, I'd put it out to him that it is, which good news is it? I think his heart actually probably is more to the one that I've talked about, but somehow I think, maybe in the constraints of the job and his feeling of wanting to hold everything together, that original euangelion can be lost. But look at someone like Jordan Peterson, who in 3-4 years ago was rocking stages with biblical teaching. He was largely, wonderfully rambling and not a theologian. And I think was opening that first evangelion, that if we really believe this book, this is an invasion into our lives, and we have to take this seriously. I just wish those higher above the food chain would have that. I pray for them to have that confidence, because I think it would move hearts and minds in a way, in numbers of orders of magnitude that would astonish them.
Yeah.
But if we go to the good news as candy only,
it's got to have thanatos.
It's going to go nowhere, because candy rots your teeth in the end.
It's got to have thanatos. It's got to have astonishment.
Thank you for articulating that, Daniel, because that really makes sense. And I watched all those Bible lectures. That really made sense. Thank you. Jamie, do you want to then round off a little bit about Christmas as the other two have had their say?
I mean, to be honest with you, Danny, I feel like what has been said is extremely profound. So I won't try and add to it too much. I just to pick up on what you said, just to say how grateful I am to everyone who's listened to the podcast and has watched it and supported it. And I've said this in various ways already this week, but just that I hope that that whatever happens over the next few weeks, I hope everyone focuses as much as they can on having a spiritual Advent and a happy Christmas, and don't let the government fear mongering ruin it for you. I think there is a sense in which that is the intention, and since it is the intention, we have to work all the harder to make sure it doesn't happen. So have a very spiritual Advent and have a very happy Christmas, and do your best to make sure you're not distracted and put off by it and filled with fear and worry and anxiety, and that your life isn't characterized by division. And the best way to do that is to fix your eyes on Christ, the best way you know how. So that's what I'd say to people.
Amen. Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. That's another episode of the Infinite Jigsaw podcast, a very special one. Please do get in touch with comments and emails and whatever. And if you do want us to come again to do a more extended Christmas special, then you should have to send those comments in, and I should have to convince these three gents to get together with me again in the next couple of weeks. But until then, it's been absolutely amazing to talk to all three of you together. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the 2022 retrospective in 12 months' time.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks so much, Danny. Cheers.
Right. Cheers. Ta-ra. Bye.